After 60 years of films, it can be hard to remember that the character of James Bond once lived only in the pages of pulp novels. Ian Fleming's Bond had some of the trappings of the film persona, but was more flawed, more thoughtful, slightly more realistic, and 100% more likely to fight a giant squid hand-to-hand. Dr. No wasn't the first Bond novel, but it was the first to be turned into a movie, and the first to feature his classic gun. We wanted to know what the original Bond was like, so we dusted off some old paperbacks and made gin and tonics to fight off malaria and remind ourselves of the glorious days when the sun didn't set on the British Empire. Join us for episode 81 of Toasting the Classics, Dr. No by Ian Fleming. Welcome to Toasting the Classics, the podcast where we take something that people call a classic and we talk about it while we drink something inspired by the classic. Then we're going to decide whether it still should be a classic. My name is Dave McArthur.
And my name is Clint Lanier. And, before we start, folks, let's just say that Dave actually has a really high, squeaky voice. It's amazing how he can turn on that announcer's voice just at the drop of a hat.
I know. You get these dulcet tones on here. It's amazing.
It's amazing. This episode, we are doing my pick. It's a book. And we are doing the Ian Fleming classic, purported classic. Alleged classic, right? Dr. No, published in 1957, 1958. Let's see. I think it was 19.
I think it was a little earlier.
1958, according to this publication history.
Okay.
Released 31st of March, 1958 in the UK. Sold approximately 115,000 copies. Mm-hmm. Then it was American edition was published in June of that same year.
Now, should we point out that we're doing something a little different on Toasting Classics this time? Should we point out what we're up to, or are we just going to surprise everybody?
I think just surprise everybody. So released, it was, like I said, 115,000 copies. So, modest success. I wish I had sold 115,000 copies my first year,
right?
Any of my books.
And this is the sixth book in the series. So these books have been coming out since the early 50s. And I think there's pretty much one every year.
Right.
And
that's correct.
One of my favorite things about reading the book versus watching a James Bond film is that the book is more sequential. There's stuff going on at the beginning of the book that is from the end of the last book. And honestly, if the James Bond films did that, I'd be a much bigger James Bond film. The serial nature of the movies, how they're just over and then there's a completely next one and there's hardly any reference to it, is the one thing that doesn't grab me about the series.
Yeah, this is, the books are a lot like the Simpsons universe in that there is really no time scale. Oh, I'm sorry, the movies are a lot like the Simpsons universe in that there's really no time scale. You don't know what happened first. You don't know what happened last time. The books certainly do. I mean, this book starts off, as he says, the sixth in the series. The reason I chose the sixth book in the series instead of the first was the first book, Casino Royale, written in the early 1950s, I think 52 or 53. Was never really successful. It had 3 print runs, but it was very, very moderate. Never really made it out of the UK. I mean, they didn't even make a movie about that film until Daniel Craig's character, and that
Craig,
and that was many, many years later, and it didn't follow the book very much at all. So I chose this book because this is the first book they made a movie out of. You're right. It's not in sequential order according to the movies.
You were saying that the movies are like Simpsons episodes, but they're like Simpsons Treehouse of Horror episodes. They're even worse. It's like nothing that happened in the last film as anything they could reset and
never makes it into it, right? True. Yeah. At least Ned Flanders stays dead. And so what we should do is we should concentrate on the book because it's not fair.
Yes.
I mean, we're looking at the book and we can talk about the books. And I really want to get into Ian Fleming's life. I'd like to get into the books themselves. And obviously we're going to talk about differences. We can focus more on this particular book. You're right. It is sequential. I'd only read another one of the books, and I'm sorry, I can't for the life of me remember what it's called.
Oh, I was going to ask about that if you'd ever read any of these. So my stepdad had like a full collection of James Bond novels, and I saved them. I put them aside when I was in high school, and I was like, oh, I should read these someday. Never read them, ended up donating them when my parents passed away. I never got around.
That's a shame.
I literally just got rid of those books a year before we did this show.
Oh man, what a pity.
So I had to buy the book in order to read it this time.
Well, we're going to come back to why you should have kept those in just a minute. Okay. And why I'm going to go out as soon as I can. I'm going to use bookstores, see if I can find any of these used. Okay. But my dad was the same way. I would spend summers at my grandma's house and my dad's old library was in there. My dad was very much a nerd like me, and he had the full collection from the the 50s first print run. So he was like in high school middle school and high school when they came out.
Yeah,
and
I think my dad was too.
I think the only one I read was, and I can't remember which one it was. It's the one where he has to go to Japan. So he's undercover in Japan.
Well, you were telling me about the whole thing where that's where we got the idea of drinking sake warm.
Yes, yes. You Only Live Twice was that one.
You only
That's that's the book I read. And at the end of that book, he ends up getting the crap kicked out of him. And at the beginning of this book, they're referencing where he just got out of the hospital after being there for a month or something like that.
Yeah, he almost died at the end of From Russia with Love, apparently, in the book.
Right.
I don't remember the girl being a big threat in the film From Russia with Love. It was it's Clint is the bad guy in From Russia with Love.
Right. And the girl runs off and falls in love with him.
Nice.
We'll tell you what, before
both of us happily married, by the way.
That's right. That's right. Well, I am no James Bond. I'm more like to think of myself more as I am a professor.
You're probably more of an Indiana Jones, right?
Oh, yeah, there you go. Indiana Jones, professor of rhetoric. Let's make a drink. So,
okay.
The drink that we are going to make, it's in the book. Well, I won't say it surprised me. Maybe it's my biggest surprise.
It's notably not his famous drink.
It's notably not. He goes to Jamaica, has his first drink in the book. He orders a double gin and tonic, and one whole green lime.
Sorry, but can we talk about? He's a secret agent, expecting to be in combat, needing his wits about him, and he drinks like a fish through this whole book.
This is in the 1950s.
What? I don't understand. So, did anybody ever think that perhaps their secret agents would perform at a higher level if they weren't drunk all the time? That doesn't seem like. Maybe that's why the British Empire fell.
I told you that before. Sacrilege. Well, like any good limey, I'm gonna dump a whole lime, squeeze out a whole lime into my cup.
Okay.
That's what he does. What
proportions do you recommend I use for tonic and?
It's 3 parts tonic water and anywhere from 1 to 3 parts gin. I mean, you can add 1 ounce tonic and 1 ounce gin, or 3 ounces tonic and 1 ounce gin. So let me tell you the history of gin and tonic if you're not familiar with it. It's kind of an interesting history.
I know a little bit about the whole quinine situation.
Yeah, that's what it was. So the British Empire colonizes India.
It just has a healthful smell.
It does, doesn't it?
I think it's the tonic. I think tonic I know it's not making me any healthier by drinking this drink, but it feels like it is in some way.
So the Brits go to India. They're stationed there, and we're talking the late 19th century. And they're issued as an anti-malarial medicine. They're issued quinine, which is a very bitter-tasting drug. Well, to make it more palatable, they mix that quinine with sugar water, and then they mix both of those with gin, which was their drink of choice in the kingdom. When they come home, they have this taste for this drink called a gin and tonic, and that's how the gin and tonic was born. Anti-malarial medicine or anti-COVID medicine, I guess.
Kind of $1 million question here. Does it? I seem to recall tonic saying when I was a kid that it still contains quinine. Is that not the case anymore?
Well, mine does. Mine says contains quinine. That's what makes tonic a tonic, is the quinine. It's has that weird kind of funky taste to it.
Oh, okay.
Beautiful, delicious drink.
It is a good drink, though. It is a good, solid drink.
It's a very British drink, which is why, it makes sense that he would drink that. It's probably what Ian Fleming drank.
Well, it's very British Empire, if you know what I mean. It's like British Raj. Like, it's not what you would drink in Britain. I mean, I'm sure they do to some extent drink them in Britain, but it's because they brought it home from Empire. Because this is something that I would want to drink in the tropics.
Yes.
Or as the case may be, on a July day in New York City where it's 95 degrees and super humid. So,
how about 105 degrees in southern New Mexico? Because that's where I'm at.
That's hot. I'm not going to say that a dry heat is not still hot, but I think it's less pleasant here. I think when it's in the 90s in New York, I think it's
with
worse.
Humidity.
And as I have said many, many times, it will go down to about 92 when the sun goes down. Whereas in New Mexico, the temperature will drop 30 degrees at night, and that's really nice.
Oh, even better. Okay, so we have our drink. So let's talk.
Let's talk about this Dr. No book.
Let's talk about this Dr. No.
This Fleming cat wrote.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about Ian Fleming. He was an interesting dude.
Well, do we want to talk about the book itself before we get into? Well, okay, sure. Go for it.
I know the story so intimately. Let's summarize the story. Why don't you summarize the story since this is the first time you've read it?
It's the first time I've read it. I've never even seen the film. So the first thing
Okay.
I did was read this book. Okay.
Mhm.
So it's a story, and it's really was nothing like I expected it to be. It's both a worse book and a much better book than I expected it to be. I expected Tom Clancy level of
Uh-huh.
writing,
Right.
which is technical and competent, but
Yes.
this is both idiotic. There's some idiotic things that happen in this book,
Yeah.
but
Yes.
also like clearly inspired by his travels in Jamaica, and it's
Yes.
almost like a travel log. And
Yes.
there's a lot about the nature, the wildlife of Jamaica, and the
Hmm.
geography
Hmm.
of Jamaica.
Right.
I thought that stuff was great. I
Yeah.
would read that. Like I would read books like that if every one of his books was a spy novel that took place in some country, but also functions as a travel narrative of that
Hmm.
country.
Hmm.
I'd be down. I have no idea what the other books are like. I've still never read any of them, but that was really cool. I enjoyed that. So it's a story of two British operatives who get murdered in Jamaica because this is during the days of the British Empire. Actually, fittingly, I believe the year this book came out might be the year of Jamaican independence.
I
It's
believe
it's
so.
right
Yeah.
on the edge. And
Yeah.
he mentions it like an impending storm or crisis. You know, he talks about
Right.
how they're in this beautiful colonial building. Oh, and it's going to be torn apart when the Jamaicans get independence. And it's like,
Right.
okay, I'm sure they're going to be okay running their own country, but that's fine. So it's right on the cusp of the end of the empire in a lot of places, and that's really I thought palpable throughout the book, that sort of
Hmm.
sense of the empire. He's been injured, and so he gets sent on what's supposed to be a cushy job to check out the disappearance of these two MI6 operatives. And he goes down to Jamaica, gets mixed up in what would become, I think, sort of the typical James Bond plot, the almost like Austin Powers parody of a James
Hmm.
Bond plot, which
Right.
is a creepy, handicapped foreign villain living
Hmm.
in a lair who unnecessarily complicates the murder of James Bond,
Right.
allowing James Bond to escape and thus thwart him. Spoiler
Right.
alert,
Right.
James Bond does survive and thwart Dr. No at the end of this
Yes.
story. So that's the basics. I thought it was a pretty good story. One of the things that I've noticed, like we've read a lot of books for this show, and I remember when we read Stephen King, I
Hmm.
remember picking it up, and I've heard a lot of complaints about Stephen King's writing over the years, but I picked up that book and I read it and I was done with it, and it was just a breeze to read it.
Hmm.
You know, I think Carrie's one of his better books, but any Stephen King novel is a pretty good yarn, pretty
Hmm.
good page turner. You're not bored, even if it's
Right.
not a good Stephen King book. And I
Right.
thought this was like that. I read this one through. I didn't pause. I was
Hmm.
enjoying reading the book. There's tons of problematic stuff going on that we should probably talk about in this
Hmm.
book.
Hmm.
And I guess we'll talk about that when we talk about toasting it, because it's going to come into whether I would recommend it to somebody. I think
Hmm.
it clearly pretty dated. So you said you had not read this book before,
Correct.
but you're familiar with the story because you know the film.
Right.
So I don't know how much we want to get into the differences with the film, but
Yeah.
it's pretty faithful. There's changes. There's some things we could talk about
There.
for changes,
Yeah.
but overall, if you know the movie, you're reading almost like a novelization. I've read
Right.
novelizations when I was a kid. I used to love reading novelizations of movies
Hmm.
because I just had no taste. I guess I don't know why I did that, but you would notice they would change things. There'd be scenes. For instance, one of my favorites, and this is totally crazy, one of my favorite novelizations was the novelization of Goonies,
Hmm.
which I read like 10 times when I was a kid. And there's
Right.
a whole sequence where they fight an octopus, which is
I
fitting for
remember
this.
that. I remember that.
And
I think I
it
read
got
that
cut
too.
from the
Yeah.
film. It got cut from the film, and there were whole sequences in the book that weren't in the film. And this would be comparable. This is
Yeah.
about like that, the level of difference between a novelization of a film and a film.
Yeah.
So there's not terribly much that's different. The basics of the plot are completely faithful.
Yeah. I mean, you forgot that along the way he meets the beautiful damsel in distress and rescues
That's
her.
right.
And I don't want to compare it to the film, Doctor No, but we can compare it generally to the films because that's a lot easier, I think. There is a difference between a James Bond book, the James Bond character in a book, and a James Bond character in a movie. And the difference to me is the James Bond character in a book is very fallible. He
Yes.
seems to
Yep.
be much more
Yep.
sensitive.
Yep.
He seems to have self-doubt. He makes mistakes, right? Which I guess is fallible. He gets injured. He's mortal, right? He's human. And James Bond in the movie is a superhero. Okay. He can't die. He always gets out of trouble. He always has the last word. He never takes advice. He doesn't need advice. He has no self-doubt. He always makes the right decision. And
So there's a couple of things I wanted to say about that. One of my favorite things about the book versus watching one of the movies is that he's fallible. I am not super interested in watching a guy go through an adventure that just is always right.
Right.
There's a place for that. There's a place like Sean Connery's James Bond, and I think especially Roger Moore's James Bond. It's just this paragon of like always being right and just like a kind of what am I looking for? I don't know if toxic masculinity is the right word for it, but something that can definitely spill over into toxic masculinity, like never asking for directions kind of mentality. Right. James Bond does not pull over the car and ask for directions. Right. And Sean Connery's James Bond doesn't either, but I think Roger Moore takes it to a more extreme in that sense.
Sure.
Daniel Craig's Bond is a better Bond. He's a much more interesting character because he gets hurt, because he screws up. He there's a little continuity between the films in terms of his changes in character. He's way more interesting to me as a character. I love Sean Connery. Sean Connery is awesome. I like watching him on the screen, but Daniel Craig's character is much more interesting to me.
Correct.
And I think that this Bond from the book. So I've always thought that Indiana Jones is inspired by Bond in a lot of ways. You get the cold open, you get the guy who travels around the world getting in adventures. He gets the girl everywhere he goes. I think Indiana Jones is more inspired by the book version. He's smarter. He's more fallible. He gets hurt. I think he's just, and I think that's why that character always appealed to me a little bit more than Roger Moore's Bond, which is what was going on when I was growing up. Sure. I discovered Sean Connery a little bit later, but anyway, I thought this Bond was way more fun to read about. I thought this guy was really cool.
And he's supposed to be, and he's much more of a detective than a superhero in the movies. I mean, in the movies, Ian Fleming never introduced all of those like gadgets and exploding this, and you have a watch that can shoot laser beams and stuff like that. He had normal spycraft type of stuff, as they would call it, things like a hidden knife, perhaps. Or
there's some fascination with gear and with technology. It just happens to be really, really outdated technology, like like the first satellites. If you're reading a book in 1958 and it was about satellites and rockets, I mean, that's like us reading about AI. It's like we just, in 1958, it's the year after Sputnik, you just heard about satellites for the first time.
No, that's a good point. That's a good point. Yeah, no, that's a really good point.
Exciting stuff, I would think.
I like what you said about the writing style. It's very, I mean, this is what we would sort of call pulp fiction. I mean, this was, a dime store novel type of thing, although they made it in hardcover, but it's not literature. And Ian Fleming himself knew that he wasn't writing literature. Well, let's talk about him for a minute. So Ian Fleming is a very well-heeled person as a person, meaning he came from very like immense wealth in England.
Yeah.
From a very
not like landed gentry, but yeah, definitely a wealthy person. Like
when you own a bank, when your family owns a bank. When your family owns a bank and an investment company, with your last name on it, then each with their last name on it, that you're doing pretty well. So his grandfather, I believe, had this big finance company, and they owned a bank. And his father was a minister of parliament, and so on. And until he died in World War I. I mean, he died from artillery shelling on the Western Front. And
a lot
so
of casualties in the family in war, because he lost a brother in World War II.
Yep.
Lost his I guess it was his girlfriend, died during a bombing raid. Definitely right at the center of the
absolutely.
British conflicts, during that time. So,
but he grew up. He had a charmed life. I mean, he went to boarding school. From there, he got to go to a private school in Austria, and then he went to a private school in Geneva. What we would call college, university or something. Came back and he studied for a foreign officer exam.
Have you ever run into the British thing where private school is called public school? It's so confusing.
Yeah, it's very
When they say I went to a public school, they mean Eton. They mean a place that's a private school, the way we say it. And I'm like, why are you calling that a public school? That's not public.
Well, but then they have a whole system of what you test into publicly for the what we would consider public.
What we would call public, right?
So you go to either a vocational school or an academic school. Like all the Beatles went to a vocational school, which could be they call them an art school, but an art school might have welding. It was really weird. I don't get it. But in any case,
you can make sculptures out of Alexander Calder did a lot of welding, right?
Yeah, you're right. Anyway, he went to the private version of the public version. So Eton was one of the places that he went as an example. But so he comes from this kind of landed class of and like old school money British, right? So the family would intervene on his behalf and get him positions, these high paying positions as a journalist. And then as World War II started, apparently the commandant of the Navy, somehow he became the personal secretary to that guy, and then became, I think a commander and a lieutenant commander in Her Majesty's Navy and or His Majesty's Navy at the time, I guess.
At the time.
Yeah.
In fact, that comes up in the book because there's a picture of George VI on the wall.
Yes.
I was like, well, didn't Queen Elizabeth take over in 53? I don't understand.
I don't know. It doesn't quite make sense, does it? But maybe he was just stuck in the past. Couldn't bow to a woman, perhaps. I don't know. But So, but I mean, and then in the war, and then in World War II, that's where he found that he was a really good administrator. He just had a knack for it, for planning and for the tactical type of stuff, or strategic type of stuff, rather. He was in charge of all these different commando groups through World War II, all these different amazing plots. And I mean, and it really is the stuff of novels,
Did you read about Operation Goldeneye?
Goldeneye, yeah, which was one of them, yeah.
That sounded pretty. It was a plan to leave a rump British force in Spain if Franco ever officially allied with the Germans and cut off contact completely. So they were going to hide out and try to hang on to Gibraltar, basically. So we had a whole plan. It's pretty important program, I would think. That's not insignificant. So
when you command the entrance there So I mean, he really distinguished himself as a planner, administrator during World War II. After World War II, that he was decommissioned, which is a very kind of weird way to put it, but he was decommissioned. During World War II, he went to Jamaica, and he vowed that after the war, that's where he wanted to live.
Okay.
So after the war, he sort of he was a journalist. So he would write for The Sun and for other papers, and he would spend 3 months of the year in Jamaica. While he was there, he started writing and came out with his first book. I believe it was 50. I want to say 52. It was Casino Royale.
I think so, yeah.
And he drew on all of his experience. James Bond is a member of MI6. He worked with members of MI6. And a matter of fact, he's threatened to be relegated back down to MI5 if he doesn't do something. I don't know. Oh, I think Emma's always threatening that. So yeah, God
it's funny you couldn't do that. You couldn't do that in the US. That's definitely two entirely separate things. Like you could not be demoted to the FBI if you screw up the CIA.
Well, that's why he's more of a detective in the books. I mean, that he's much more of an FBI agent that can go around the world.
Dr. No calls him a dumb policeman,
right? Exactly.
Or is that in the film?
I think that's in the film.
Sorry,
I think that's in the film. But he says it. Actually, he says the line to Honeychild Ryder that he's a detective of sorts.
By the way,
policeman of sorts.
By the way, Honeychild Ryder.
Honeychild Ryder.
Some of the names that he uses are just, I mean, I guess they're tongue in cheek, but they are distractingly awful names. I mean, Honey. Yeah. I mean, it makes sense given her backstory, which, by the way, we didn't mention. She's sort of a Tarzan character almost. Yes, although she was raised by people, but she was raised essentially in the wilderness, like living on her own in a lot of ways. But
and she's like a friend to all plants and animals, type of thing. Yeah. So it's the backstory of Honeychild or Honey. Let's just call her Honey.
So she grows up kind of living in the wilds of Jamaica and knows everything about all the different creatures. And there's a guy who assaults her when she's younger, breaks her nose, and gives her a big flaw, according to James Bond, that he gets used to. And she gets him back by putting a spider. Or does that happen in the movie?
No, it happens in the movie.
That's in the movie.
No, it happens in the book too. No, it happens in both. That is exactly. Yeah, that part's exactly the same.
So I don't understand this. I feel like this is a dangling thread because when I read that, I was like, oh, so she's the one that put the centipede in his bed. because that's what she does. Is she uses dangerous creatures? Never explained. We never
Oh,
learned where the centipede come from. The centipede thing, it gets turned into a spider in the film.
Okay, well,
and then it gets, but it gets explained. But my point is, you see who did it.
Let's tell the three listeners that we have. Let's tell them what's going on. So there's at some point when James Bond is investigating around the island, he feels a twitch. He goes to bed at night in his hotel, feels a twitch on his leg.
After banging out 3 or 4 cocktails.
Right. Passing out. He feels this twitch on his leg and this thing's crawling up his leg. He realizes it's like a 5-inch centipede rather, crawls up his leg, and he's able to hold so still that it crawls off him, and then he kills it. He smashes it with the shoe. But it's never explained who did it, how that happened. He asks Quarrel is his Cayman Island by the way of Jamaica.
Right. Living in Jamaica, but is a Cayman Island.
Confederate, co-worker guy, helper. He asks him, are centipedes common? And he says, only in the bush. They would never see them in the city, and they could kill somebody and blah, blah, blah. So it's assumed that somehow Dr. No put that in his room, and a centipede crawls up his leg. James Bond holds so still that the centipede crawls over him. James Bond jumps out of the bed and kills the centipede with his shoe. It took me maybe less than 100 words to explain what happened. That happened in the space of about 10 pages.
Yeah, it goes on for a long time.
It does. And that's sort of what he does, because he gives you like the thought process of Bond. Oh my God, soon it'll be up to my belly button. And then what? Yeah. Perhaps he'll make a home in my belly button. What if he does that? How would I ever get him out of my belly button? It's just like he just goes on and on and on, in these parts. And that does get a bit tiresome after a bit. I'm not wanting him to be Hemingway, where he just cuts to the chase at every sentence.
Right.
But I think it's a very British thing to really draw stuff out.
I don't know. People complained about it. People were definitely like, "There's 80,000 words in this book and 8,000 words of plot."
Yes, yeah, people did.
Which I didn't think. I thought the book cooked pretty good. I thought it had a good pace. There is a little bit of belaboring the centipede situation.
Yes, sure. Among others. I mean, there were quite a few. That was one example. I mean, there were other parts kind of throughout it where I like belabored. That's a good term for it. He does.
Honestly, there were a few too many confrontations with animals for my taste in a spy book. I'm not sure that's the way I would. Again, that's a little bit more like Indiana Jones, right? The snakes and the spiders and all kinds of stuff like that. Whereas, in a spy, it's kind of weird if Daniel Craig had to like box a fox or like at some point in one of. I'm sorry, I made that rhyme. It sounded like a Dr. Seuss movie.
I think that is a Dr. Seuss. Box the fox.
It'd be very strange if a gibbon showed up and like had a wrestling match with James Bond in the middle of Casino Royale. Right. But I detected some inspiration in this book that I thought I'd run by you and see what you think.
Okay.
So first of all, I didn't even think of this because frankly, I think Fu Manchu is kind of dead letter. Like nobody talks about Fu Manchu anymore, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
So the Fu Manchu was the basis. He definitely ripped off things from Fu Manchu books for the character of Dr. No. But what I noticed it's Captain Nemo. And that because Captain Nemo means Captain Nobody, and Dr. No is the same thing. And he's like a super villain, like super intelligent, independent villain who's trying to destroy world shipping and has a really sweet aquarium in his place. And I kind of thought that was in there. And then and now I also thought The Most Dangerous Game. That was in there. The guy who owns this island and puts you through an obstacle course and tries to kill you. I didn't see anybody mention that being an inspiration, but it must have been, right? And that's an old story that goes back before this because there's an old movie about it. So I think, that's probably an inspiration.
Wow, 1924.
Yeah, I was thinking it goes way back, right? Yeah. Here's something I think people have probably pointed out about James Bond before, and it definitely applies in the book. I noticed it right away. It's pretty dumb to use your name.
Yeah.
Especially to have your name like prominently announce it to people. And it's your real name. Like there's no indication that James Bond is a code name. Right. He just goes around telling everybody his name. That's not very First thing
Well,
I would do as a spy is
yeah,
not tell people my real name.
he's a very confident spy. I guess we could give him that. You know,
Okay.
you know.
Okay.
Oh, but
Confident.
he does when he gets to Doctor No's lair. He does call himself like John Bryce, though. So,
Oh, okay. I didn't catch
you
that.
know,
All right. My
yeah.
bad.
So,
All right, fair enough. Fair enough. Well, once you're in the villain's lair, you can't give your real name. You don't want to go back to London and find Dr. No sitting on your front porch, like waiting
right,
for you with
right.
a machine gun, because she's like, "Oh,
Although,
you announced yourself as James Bond and told me your address was London West 9." Like
right. Well, I think also in the book they were waiting for him. Somehow they knew that he was coming. Um,
right,
they took a picture of him at the airport. The secretary at the British attache's place was in on it. I mean, so they I think they already, and that might, you don't know. I mean, I'm reading into it, and my thought process is he figures whatever, they already know, so I might as well tell them.
yeah,
Although they send him some poisoned, and in the hotel he seems surprised, like, how did they find me? Somehow they
yeah,
found me. I'm sure there are probably, like, I don't know, 6 hotels, so it
yeah.
might
Well,
take you all of
also because you
15
got
minutes
off
to
the
figure it out.
plane, you got off
Yeah.
the plane. You said, "Hello, my name is Bond, James Bond. I'll
Mhm.
be staying at the Ambassador
Yeah,
Hotel on
exactly. Right, right.
Jamaica Beach."
So
You know,
yeah,
I don't think it was
but
that hard to track you down. Also, well, I guess probably not as true in those days, but I would think just some white dude getting off a plane would probably stand out in Jamaica. I don't know. Maybe that's not true. I've actually
I
never
don't
been.
know.
I've been to the
As
Dominican Republic, and
as a British colony, I mean, you have to,
that's true. Different. It was
so
different at the
the
time.
population was probably fairly small, but you had a big contingent of British military and government there, because
Right.
that was sort of, they had been controlling that since the 17th century. So,
Like I said, I've never actually been there, but I think there are
mhm.
still quite a few holdovers that stayed there after independence. So I don't think it's that
Yeah, I'm
strange.
sure.
It was strange, and I've wondered about this before. I've wondered if you're white and you're from Jamaica, do you have that Jamaican accent? And that's why when Honey Child, I have to say, I listened to this as an audiobook, by the way,
Okay.
and the guy gives Honey Child Ryder a Jamaican accent, and I was like, oh, because he mentions that she has a Jamaican accent in the text,
That's
but then the
interesting.
guy,
I was wondering
but
about
then
that.
every time she talks, she's like, "Oh, James, you got to take me over here." Let's do it. I'm like, this is weird. Like, it's weird to picture a white girl talking like that. But if she was raised alone by a Jamaican nanny, of course she
Yeah.
would talk like that. So,
Blonde hair, blue eyed, white.
yeah. But
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
also have always wondered, would there be people who talk like that?
So is her name supposed to be Honey Child? Is that her
Yeah.
name?
Yes.
Okay. All
Yes.
right.
Yes. Yes.
So when you read it, it's Honey Child. I'm from New Mexico. The first thing I read was honey chili. I was like, that makes no sense at all.
Honey chili.
Mr.
Yeah, that's
Fleming,
funny.
what were you drinking when you wrote this? And
Definitely.
and so I said, well, it can't be honey chili. So obviously, honey child. We all have to be sensitive. I don't want to stay. Is it supposed to be honey child? Because that's, I don't want to pronounce it like that every time, because
No, I
I
think it's supposed to
myself
be
happen
honey
to be a white guy.
child.
Yeah,
But it's
I just couldn't
definitely
do it.
it's definitely not honey chili. I can tell you that. In my professional
Right.
opinion, as an Ian
Yeah.
Fleming scholar, it is not honey chili.
She came from a landed family, right? A very wealthy family
Right.
that lost it all when she was a child. Okay. And the parents died when she was a child, and the Jamaican nanny took her over. And I'm thinking, okay, did the Jamaican nanny name her? why would
I
it,
think
why would
no.
doesn't
I think it's the Jamaican lady called her that, and that she took that as her name. So that wouldn't. I don't know. That doesn't make a lot of sense because
I
it's
don't
not like if you have a familiar, you call a child honey child. You also have an
know.
actual name for them
I think
as well.
that's one of those things that
Yeah.
I got to remember when I enter the great beyond. If Ian Fleming is there, I shall ask him what. Well, I don't get this. This doesn't make sense to me. And she was old enough when they died, because she was only like 5 or 6 or something. She had a name.
I don't have like a perfect memory of being a child, but when I was 5, I knew what my name was.
Exactly.
Like
Right.
you wouldn't have
Right.
needed to start calling me Honey Child.
So
I'd just be like, oh yeah, my name's Honey Child. Sure, that makes
yeah.
sense.
Okay.
Yeah.
Whatever. Like I said, the writing, I was like, huh. I guess there was a lot more latitude on making up words.
Okay.
Um,
What? Like what?
so one of the big climax parts of the book was that James Bond has to battle a kraken, a giant squid, which
Yeah.
I was not expecting it all. And he sticks a knife into the squid's one of the squids. He calls it an arm, a tentacle.
Okay. Right.
And he says it's very puddingy. I've never heard that word before.
Puddingy. Yeah.
Puddingy. I like doughy. Okay, like a doughy
I mean,
face.
that's
Or,
fair.
okay.
I get that. Puddingy.
Puddingy. I mean, I guess what you do is just put a gy after
It
the
becomes
end
an
of
adjective.
anything.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So
yeah, exactly.
so this is very boardy. Like somebody
Fair.
has
That's a fair.
like it's like a board. It's boardy. If something is stale, it's staley.
No. It has to be noun plus y.
Oh, okay. Oh, that's
It has
something
to
that's
be,
stale. That's
you
already
know,
that's
he was
already
wearing
yeah.
something on his face that was very glasses-y, but wasn't glasses. You know.
But I think his glasses ghee, pudding
No,
ghee.
it would definitely not be glasses
Well,
ghee.
it should be pudding ghee, pudding ghee.
It definitely wouldn't be with puddingy. You're getting that
I don't know.
sound.
Anyway, the death of Doctor No was the most anticlimactic
Yeah.
death of a big villain bad guy I have ever read about.
And not to belabor the film book conclusion, but that's the same in the film.
Yeah,
Dr. No goes out like a punk in both. Like it's really
he does, but at least
he's actually a really cool villain, especially if you put yourself in the mind of that long ago. Although I have to say, he's like Captain Nemo or he's like the guy from Most Dangerous Game. It's not an entirely new archetype of the sort of evil
not a
genius, you know. It's
yeah.
Definitely something that's been done before, but
you mentioned disabled. There is a thing about villains and disabilities that's kind of alarmingly common, but so that most villains have some type of disability or something like that.
I mean, do we want to talk about all the problematic bits in this? Because
let's talk about that in a minute. I want to focus on his death for just a bit. Okay. So ignoble in that he dies in a mountain of poo. Okay, bird poo. Right, but he dies in a mountain of poo.
But it's appropriate. His empire was founded on poo.
Was built on poo. But you would think that it would be a little bit more personal, like James Bond would be there to stick his gun in the guy's gut and shoot him after this, this big fight or something like that. He would do something really cool because that's what would happen now. Daniel Craig would not bury a guy in poo to kill him. Well, the main villain, I would say he'll kill like the hired hands any day of the week. The minions, he'd kill them like that, bury them in poo, no big deal.
You can use poo on a minion.
Yes, absolutely.
Use poo on a minion.
But Daniel Craig would get close. He always gets close up to the villain, and he kills him in a very, justified manner. He would find these big pneumatic pinchers, which would replicate the guy's hands, and he would cut them in half with them or something like that. I mean, that's what would happen. I read that and I was so dismayed. And not only was I dismayed, but that's not the climax of the end. In any good book, like the villain dies sort of right before the end of the movie.
It's pretty close. It's just kind of a denouement after it, right? I mean,
the villain dies and then a bunch of other stuff happens afterwards. So he has to escape and yada yada yada.
Well, have you ever read The Hobbit? Oh, sorry, not The Hobbit, Lord of the Rings, the original.
Of course, yes, trilogy. Of course.
Like there's the great big confrontation in Return of the King and the fight against Sauron. That's midway through Return of the King. There's like 150 pages after that. There's a whole other. I feel like maybe British books back then didn't really understand the concept of.
Well, we'll give Tolkien a pass. Tolkien was writing like Chaucer, and so they. I mean, if you want to talk about belaboring the point, Tolkien could talk about a ring for a chapter.
I read The Fellowship of the Ring to Alex, and I got it like 5 pages in. I was like, "Hey, buddy, you want to skip all this like Hobbit genealogy stuff?"
Yeah,
He was like, "Yes, please."
Yes, yeah.
Forward. One cool thing is he gets his gun. He gets his classic gun.
Yeah. Yep. The Walther PPK. That's right.
And that's a good bit. That actually was apparently based on some guy he knew who was an armorer who was like James Bond would not carry this Beretta. I mean, this is
25 caliber. Yeah.
Is a Beretta really? I thought a Beretta was a 9mm.
Well, I mean, all of them make different calibers. So, I mean, you've got 25, 32, 38, 9mm, blah, blah, blah.
Beretta is a company that makes
weapons. Correct. That's correct.
Yeah, but the Beretta he's carrying in the first 5 books is apparently a 25 caliber.
Yes.
Which, as a if you want like a tiny little gun that you can hide easily on your person, that does make that makes sense for a spy to some extent. You'd have almost like a Derringer type of thing would be
almost. I mean, but
better than
you
nothing.
think you have to be up on them.
One of my favorite lines in the book is when he sends his after action report to M, and he says Smith and Wesson ineffective against Flamethrower.
right. And then he says he regrets sending that because it'll make M mad. But oh well,
M is like an antagonist in this book.
M is a weird character. I think throughout.
M is an antagonist I think it's in the Pierce Brosnan movies. It's the Judi Dench version of M is definitely like she hates Bond. Like there's a big thing between them, and they grow to have a better working relationship through the films. But otherwise, M was almost like I don't know if he's a comic character in Goldfinger, but he's not Bond's enemy. He's not.
This was written by a Brit with that sort of worldview, and as a culture, they have a very stiff upper lip. Down to brass tacks type of approach to life. I mean, that's what they're supposed to have. So it's a very
sorry, Bond, but you won't be carrying that gun anymore. You fool.
Yeah, exactly. It's a very.
It's just like okay, whatever.
It's a very let's cut through everything, and this is how it is type of thing. Don't beat around the bush. And I think M kind of personifies the British authority figure for the book.
I think that's fair. I came across a concept I had never thought of before called the Fleming effect. Did you read about that?
No.
So this is something that Kingsley Amis referred to. He said, I read one of his books, actually. He actually be really interesting to do for this show because Kingsley Amis did this drinker's guide. Interesting. That would be really fun to read for this show. But anyway, he was a big critic of writing, and he called the Fleming effect was all the real details and brand names and things that Fleming kind of throws at you to create this sense of the real in the book, put you in the real world, just distract you from the fact that this is a ridiculous situation and a world. The world is not real at all. And I almost think it's kind of similar to the concept of hyperrealism. I thought it's something I wanted to look into a little bit later because I always was interested in that idea of taking a real world setting and it's like you're telling a ridiculous story. For instance, the example I always think of is 300. The film 300 has all these ridiculous things happening, and it's almost a mythic story. Everything that seems fantastical, the writers go to the trouble of couching it in something technically real. Technically, there's such a thing as giant squids. Technically, there's such a thing as the gun that James Bond is using. Technically, a white girl could be raised by a black nanny and be called Honey Child Rider. It's farcical, but it's technically anyway. So I thought that was kind of cool. So the Fleming effect is something that gets used as in literary criticism that I'd never heard of before. And I'm always trying to add to my arsenal of literary criticism terms because doing the show is like my half-butted master's degree in literature. I sort of think of it. So, did you see the drawing that Fleming commissioned of what he thought James Bond looked like?
Yes.
Sucks.
Yeah, it does. It
looks like Sherlock Holmes to me. He's all like bony and skinny, and I don't know.
So again, we're talking about a guy who had experience with characters like this, in real life, right?
Yeah.
I mean, he worked at OSS. He worked with MI6. I mean, this is the stuff that he did for, like 6 years during the war.
Right.
So he would have an idea, and so he wanted even the name James Bond to be as boring as possible. Okay.
Yeah.
Because he actually wanted a guy who would walk into a room that nobody would pay attention to. That was James Bond to him.
That would make a lot of sense for a spy.
Exactly. And that was his idea. And the book James Bond is different from the movie James Bond. He's not a superhero. In the book, he's a dude. He's just a guy that he uses very nice stuff. I mean, the guy is a well coiffed. Is that the term?
Coiffed.
I mean, coiffed. He knows these particular name brands. He shops at the right stores, but he doesn't exude that over the top masculinity that the movie does and everything else. He's just kind of a normal dude.
What I always think of is when they made the movie Die Hard and they put Bruce Willis in as the main character, And everybody was like, what are you doing? This is an action movie. Everybody wants to see Sylvester Stallone. Everybody wants to see Arnold Schwarzenegger. I'm the kind of guy, I want to watch Bruce Willis
Right.
fight the
Exactly.
bad guys, because I could almost be him. Arnold Schwarzenegger. Come on. I don't look up to Arnold Schwarzenegger. He's ridiculous. He's a ridiculous person. There's nobody's going to be like Arnold Schwarzenegger.
Yeah.
Bruce Willis on a good day. I don't know. Maybe,
I could there's a point in that movie where McCain doesn't have shoes and he has to run over that broken glass and his feet are all cut up because of it.
He gets hurt. He's flawed. He's got a bad relationship with his wife. There's all kinds of stuff. I love that kind of character. Is way more interesting to me.
Well, that was the character of James Bond in the books, not in the movies. Right. And I think it was because Ian Fleming was writing from a place where he knew this background, right? It wasn't fantasy to him. It was, and that might be something to really think about. You mentioned, who'd you mention Tom Clancy? Okay. Tom Clancy was an insurance agent. He sold insurance when he wrote Hunt for the Red October. Okay.
Right.
Now the guy was super technical. He did he did his research. And because he was so good, he got to partner with all these different, and they taught him spycraft and all this other stuff. But that's not where he came from. He came from an insurance agent. The only other guy, it's kind of funny that I mentioned him because he's a response to Ian Fleming and James Bond. John Le Carre.
Jean Le Carre. Yeah, no, I've never read any of his stuff.
I only say Le Carre because he's British. Le Carre is his last name, but he is British, and I think he might have worked for MI6. He was an intelligence analyst. Okay,
my dad is a huge Le Carre fan. He loves him. He reads all. I've never read one of his books, and I totally should. But I read his book, seminal and premiere book, which was I say seminal because it was the biggest one, but it was A Spy Who Came In From the Cold. Fantastic book. Okay. And he really criticized Ian Fleming because he said, it's actually much more boring. It's nothing like Ian Fleming novels. Right. And Ian Fleming, he never professed to do it exactly. He knew it was a fantasy, but John Le Carre or Le Carre, he's British, he's not French. Again, he wanted to do one that was real, to show you how boring it really was. So The Spy That Came In From the Cold, it drags, right? Sometimes. And the book's much thicker and it's not as exciting. And it's not these glamorous locales. Actually, Tom Clancy's books have an element of that. There's definitely the behind the scenes. There's all this stuff. The Cardinal in the Kremlin, the one about the guy who's aiding the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. That one's just, I couldn't get through that book. There's so much document shuffling and stuff, and that's the reality. I studied international relations at GW in DC. And a lot of the people in my program were studying intelligence. And that's 100% what their lives were going to be like. They were going to be analysts, never going to be in the field, nothing to do with any of that kind of stuff. But on the other hand, one of my buddies that I was friends with at school, he had a roommate who was a Chinese national, who was working somewhere in DC. And he came home one day and his entire house had been ransacked by Chinese agents. They'd just taken his laptop and torn apart his room because they thought it was the other guy's room. Those kind of things, those kind of hands-on
it does
kinetic kind of intelligence stuff, that's real. That does happen, but it's almost like two different people. Because I imagine the Chinese guy they sent to rough up his room was just some thug. He didn't know anything about espionage or that's why he went in the wrong room, for God's sake.
The thing about it is, you're not going to sell books based on intelligence analysts. Although I know Jack Ryan, but
that's what Jack Ryan but Jack Ryan is also a Marine, and he's a tough guy.
He does all this stuff, right? It has these adventures. You can't, somebody sitting in an office, looking at data, which is what they do, from somewhere. They're not going to make a movie about that. So
one thing they told us when we took the basic intelligence courses is the bad news for a guy like me is the absolute last person in the world to be field personnel is a white dude.
Yeah.
That's not the world today. We do not, our enemies don't look like that, and we do not send white guys into the field.
Not anymore.
We use women, we use brown people. That's who you're trying to blend in with. So I'm not going to be James Bond. It's not going to happen. Who am I going to spy on? France? Like it's just not, it's just not the way it works. So
Right. Like spy plane. Well, I don't know. Ukraine's there. Russia's there.
yeah, Russia. Well, nowadays, actually, I kind of wish that I'd been in that field, now rather than 12 years ago when it was all
Sure.
Afghanistan and Iraq, because I could have done the Russia thing. But anyway,
Yeah,
so
of course. Well, we're at that point. So
we're at that point. Okay, so we're gonna spare that. We're gonna spare. I think the way that I want to do it, and if you agree with me, is we'll talk about the problematic aspects and we talk about whether it's a classic. Let's talk about the surprises.
Sure.
So, you had read a James Bond book before.
I had.
So, I mean, everything about the way this book was written was a surprise to me. And so that's sort of I was surprised that it took place on location in Jamaica. I thought that was pretty cool. I felt like I got a sense of Jamaica to some extent, even though, I thought that was pretty neat. I was really surprised by all the talk about the Audubon Society and the roseate spoonbills. Stuff like that was really weird. But my biggest surprise was that he fights a freaking giant squid at the end of the book.
Yes, I love that. Yeah, that's
having been forewarned about all the natural villains that he comes up against. It's very surprising to me that probably the climactic moment is a hand-to-hand combat with a giant squid.
Well, it happens sometimes, I guess. So I don't know.
The funny thing is when this book was written, so when I was a kid, this would have been in about 1982, the Smithsonian got a hold of the first ever specimen of a giant squid. And they brought it back, and it was at the Smithsonian when I was a kid, and we went down and saw it, and were lines down the block to see the world's first giant squid that had ever been captured. It was like a myth until then, the giant squid. Like nobody had ever seen one. At the time of this book was written, this is like, you might as well be a kraken, right? Yeah. It's like an imaginary monster. So James Bond is fighting. It would be like if James Bond had a fist fight with Bigfoot at the end of the book.
Yeah. I think I would love to see that someday, by the way.
I wouldn't be surprised if that happened. It's one of the Roger Moores. I could see Roger Moore. I almost have a little bit of a Mandela effect where I feel like he did fight a Bigfoot in one of the movies.
He might have. Well, no, there's that guy named Jaws, that huge dude with the metal jaws. I think he fought, and the guy like bit his gun in half or something stupid like that. I don't know. A couple things. So, Ian Fleming's older brother Peter was a travel writer.
Okay. Interesting.
So that sort of makes sense. And actually, he would not have been published. Casino Royale would not have been published had it not been for Peter. Because apparently Peter Fleming, as a travel writer, was huge. Like he was really popular, sold a ton of books. When Ian sent his book to whatever publisher he finally sent it to in the UK, they're like, I don't know about this. And then Peter said, hey, you should publish my brother's stuff. And they're like, okay, fine. Because of you, we'll publish it. And then it turned into
that's my problem. That's my problem. I need a brother who's in the industry. I got to convince my brother to write some
nepotism. Nepotism works.
Nepotism.
Man. Just ask the Bidens. My biggest surprise was the gin and tonic. That was that.
That was a little shocking.
When I read "You Only Live Twice," I don't think I even was on the lookout for that. But I think that was before I really got into booze writing and stuff like that, which is, sort of my second job. By the way, I have a new book out called Ted Mack and America's First Black Brewery, Rise of All People's Beer. You guys should all buy it.
Available wherever
fine books are sold. Yeah.
I was gonna be mean about it, but no. We're fine. Fine books are sold. We're fine books are sold.
Yeah, thank you. Gutter books are sold. I never even noticed it. Maybe it was in that one. I know they talked about sake in that one because that, it was sort of set.
I remember we talked about sake maybe in the Godzilla episode. We talked about.
Yeah, I think so. But that was the movie. I don't even remember the book, but I will say there is so Ian Fleming wrote, and Ian Fleming, I think as a writer. Well, this is for you to say, but he wrote a nonfiction book called Thrilling Cities, something like that, or The Most Dangerous. I think I read it. It was The Most Dangerous Cities. Maybe that was made for America, but it was set in like 1961, 62, maybe late 50s. He was a journalist for maybe The Sun, whatever, some UK paper, maybe Daily Mail or something like that. Okay. And they sent him around the world, and he went to all of these essentially bars at these great cities at that time. So it was like Las Vegas, Morocco, Cuba, before it fell. So it must have been the 50s, I guess.
This is the brother.
No, this is Ian Fleming.
Oh, really? Okay.
And so he went to the bars. He went to these bars at the time. He went to like West Berlin. He went to all over the world to these.
That's a pretty good gig. Basically. It's a pretty good
Yeah,
gig
right.
if you can get it, right? Like
And
somebody
he
should
put
do like like a YouTube channel called Bucket List Bars. It's just about
wouldn't
great
be
bars
amazing? Yeah, just
around
about
the world.
great
Yeah.
bars. Yeah. In any case, that's a cool book. If you ever had a chance to read it, I definitely recommend it. All right, so that's a surprise. So now we're down to the decision time. I'm going to lobby real quick.
Okay.
Um,
Now let's
I,
make sure that we're talking about the right thing.
okay.
We have to discuss whether Dr. No by Ian Fleming, this
Yes.
instance of the novel, is a classic.
Right.
Then we have to
Right.
talk about, probably we were going to expand it to, are the Ian Fleming James Bond books classics? It's a nuance. There's a nuance there, but I think
Yes, there
it's
is. I'm going to admit a little bit of ignorance. You know, I haven't read a lot of pulp fiction in the 1950s. I don't know exactly what the competitors are. Like, I don't know if all of them read like this. You know, the writing is a bit clumsy. I admit that at times, right? Sometimes it's brilliant. I mean, he can sum up certain things very well and make them very suspenseful. But sometimes it's like honey chili, what?
that's just
Um,
yeah.
yeah. So
There's writing,
sometimes
there's the crafting of prose, and then there's
yes,
just choices.
yes,
And
right,
Honey
exactly.
Child Rider is a bad choice.
Yes, yes, I know. I agree.
That lived in a successful novel and then exists in the film. She's still called Honey Child Rider.
No,
They
no,
didn't
she's just
change
called
that.
no. They just call her Honey. They cut it down to Honey
Oh,
Rider.
okay. All right.
Okay,
All right. All right. I
but
was wondering about that. All right. Well,
but
then they
again,
did
so
change. They did change the stupid decision.
yeah, right. So there's clumsy writing, but then there's also legacy, but the problem with it is I don't really know how to compare it personally. I would contend that it's a classic because of a lot of reasons. I mean, Ian Fleming's background that gave him kind of an inside knowledge on a lot of this stuff. Also, the personification of James Bond in the novel versus, or in a novel, any of them really, versus in the movies. I prefer that, and we see them return to that, right? In the most recent movies.
He's a better Bond in the book.
Yeah, he
He's
really is because
But
he's
you
a
have the
little
problem. You have the problem in the film. Well, first of all, your films are supposed to dazzle and
yes,
entice, and
right,
like I said, create a paragon of masculinity for people to. It's escapist. You're trying to be, and
it is,
you've got
but you
Sean Connery at the height of his powers. And I'm sorry, but he's just a movie star.
yeah
Everybody wants to watch him. Nobody
yeah
wants to see him screw up. And
yes
the way he is, he's like watching Frank Sinatra walk
yeah
around and just grab
you're right.
dames by the waist and tell them what they're going to do. And he's a force of nature, and they shouldn't have screwed with it. It's perfect. It
Yeah.
looks great in the film. I prefer the character in the book,
Yes.
so it's different.
Yeah. No. And that's sort of where I'm going with this. Like, if we're going to judge the book, I think he made a character that was infinitely shapeable, maybe, or understandable character. I mean, the character of James Bond in the book is an everyman. You know, he really is. Originally, they wanted Cary Grant to play him, which
Right.
Cary Grant was the epitome of the everyman.
This is getting a little late in Cary Grant's career in
It
'62.
would have been, but like North by
We
North,
did.
was it
I don't know if
North
you.
by
I don't know if you
Northwest or
listen. I
something
don't know
like
if you
that?
listened to the show that we did on To Catch a Thief, but that's also sort of
All
latter
right,
day
To Catch a
Cary
Thief.
Grant.
Yeah,
Cary Grant 10 years before that would have been a pretty sweet
yeah,
choice for James Bond,
yeah. It
actually.
would have
But
been. Although
31-year-old Sean Connery is better than Cary Grant.
I agree, but what I'm saying is they weren't going for a. I mean, although Cary Grant was a
Cary Grant would
Hollywood
be more like your
superstar.
Roger Moore. He'd be more like your
Yes.
Roger Moore. Yeah,
Well,
he'd be
I
a
know, but
different Bond.
he exudes a bit more of an everyman because he's not built up. I mean, like Sean Connery. Well, we can talk about that later.
Yeah,
But
that's
yeah,
a whole, yeah.
yeah.
So I would say, so we got a couple of different things to deal with here.
Okay,
First of all,
yeah,
I kind of want to cast aside. I'm just going to rate this on the James Bond novel series, all of them,
yes.
without having read anything but this one. So
Okay,
that's what I'm discussing here.
all right.
Because I can't say. I don't know whether Dr. No is the best of the books or whether it's a particularly
Okay.
good.
No, that's
But
fair. That's fair.
in the pro column, it's a good read.
Mhm.
Today, it's a good read. It's got a good pace. It's fun to read. It's an interesting character. I could see why somebody decided to make a movie of this. It's corny, but it's like an Edgar Rice Burroughs character, or something like that. I mean, it's kind of silly, but it's fun. It's a fun read. So I like that. I really do think, in terms of talking about whether it's a classic, we have to deal with the questions of race and colonialism and misogyny. And the
Mhm.
misogyny, I think that sucks, but I think we can kind of cast that aside because that's kind of what you're going to James Bond for. You're kind of going, it's a male space. A James Bond film is a male space. If you don't want to be a boy for 2 hours, don't watch James Bond. Fine. I respect that decision. I get why somebody would make that decision. But James Bond is a place to go and be a boy. You're talking about guns and hooking up with girls and having adventures, and let's just embrace that. Race is creepy in this book. There's a lot there. The word chigros gets used a bunch of times, meaning it's a portmanteau for Chinese Negro, and it's weird. Were I to recommend this book to somebody who wasn't white, I would have to caveat the F out of this book by saying, okay, we're talking about this. There's a character who talks about Jamaica, and it's the local British attaché or the diplomat, some kind of diplomat of some sort. I can't remember exactly who. Somebody who worked for the governor of Jamaica, and he is just going off on the Jamaicans and how they have all these resources, but they're just too darn lazy to use them. And both that's a colonialist vibe that sucks. And, again, you'd want to, if I gave this book to my 20-year-old, 23-year-old daughter, I would have to caveat again the F out of this book before I gave it to her.
No.
Also, she's a girl, and I just don't think a modern woman would want to read this book. But if I gave it to my son, because he's a boy and he likes boy stuff, and he might like James Bond, if I gave this book to him, we'd be like, dude, just skim over the parts about race and skim over the parts about the colonialism, which is actually kind of an interesting window into the past in a way. And I was curious about whether that governor guy, the diplomat who's talking that way, that's a character in the book. I'm assuming that reflects Ian Fleming's beliefs, but that may not be fair. That may be a character. That may be describing how British colonial officials in the empire talked about native people, which would be accurate. I don't know if the book is sophisticated enough to be dealt with on that level, but again, we'd want to talk about it. In terms of whether it's a classic, I did like this book. I would read another James Bond book. And these books created James Bond, who's obviously an icon. It's really tough. It's really tough because you kind of want to. Is it a classic book? It's a really tricky question. Remind me again what we mean when we say classic.
I was just thinking we've never really defined that.
We've talked about it many times.
We should have a discussion and pin it to the very top of our episode.
It is a nebulous.
What is a classic? Right.
It is a nebulous definition that we've never landed on, and maybe we should leave it that way to keep screwing with people. Give me some thoughts about what you think a classic is, and I'll come down.
Okay, so I think a classic is something that there are derivatives of. That,
no question about that.
Right. That has somehow influenced culture, that has somehow or influenced like a whole movement of whatever the genre might be. I mean, in terms of music, separate from derivative, it has now entered a zeitgeist of sorts. What has this done for like the imagination of just general public? Derivatives are different because it's like other authors have been influenced and created. Like I said, John le Carré had created.
I've always heard it pronounced le Carré. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong.
Well, I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong. His characters in Tinker
Tailor Soldier Spy.
Soldier Spy, yeah, and The Spy Who Came In From the Cold are supposed to be anti-James Bond. But the fact that he made that anti-James Bonds says that it's a derivative of it. So
clearly, the figure of James Bond hangs over any spy book.
Yes.
Clearly.
And so I guess maybe that might be something that we could think about is if we're going to have a classic, how much influence did it have at the time and then afterwards? And maybe its influence is a thing. And what we have to do maybe is compare it, because so you're comparing it to 2023. Right. Which is always unfair, and it's always
unfair, right? Yeah, I try to be cool about that. I mean, you don't want to. It doesn't make sense, It's a very different time,
right? And so it's holding people to a standard that they didn't have at that time.
No, you shouldn't do that. You shouldn't do that. You should compare it to its contemporaries.
But I will say that it's his writing is tough sometimes to look at because you and I we have so much education that we can call ourselves learned. When you can say learned is a 2-syllable word.
Yeah, I was gonna say if it's got 2 syllables, you're pretty smart.
Yes, yeah. Right. So we are fairly learned people. God, his writing is tough to take, and he was a learned person as well.
Well, actually, this brings up a point that I meant to make and I didn't. He was a learned person, but he does refer to a shark as a reptile.
I saw that.
That is really dumb.
I can't justify that.
I don't understand
that,
but anyway.
I don't know.
That's not a thing a learned man says. A learned man does not refer to a shark as a reptile. Anyway.
So they talked about a kraken, and then afterwards the Jamaicans called it a puss as an octopus, and it wasn't. It's a squid.
No, squids and octopi and octopuses are definitely different things.
So I'm going to leave it to you. I'm going to stop with my lobbying.
It's really tough. You know what it reminds me of? I don't know if you've ever read these, but the Conan the Barbarian books by Robert E. Howard.
Mm-hmm. Actually, I have not, and that would be a good one for us to do in the future.
Those are really fun. Those are fun to read, and they are super, super backward. Mm-hmm. Super backward. It's like H.P. Lovecraft. They're very backward, although Robert E. Howard's a lot like this. And I think the thing we need to remember is that a James Bond book is not like a Tom Clancy book. A Tom Clancy book is a book that's written for a pretty sophisticated audience. Mm-hmm. Probably a boomer who's been to college, who's, following the news and keeping track of a lot of things. I think that a James Bond book is more like Conan the Barbarian. I think it's like a comic book in prose form.
That's absolutely right. Yeah,
it's like we didn't judge Fantastic Four by the fact that it wasn't operating on 5 levels of semiotics. It's a comic book, right? It's supposed to appeal to children, right? So in the sense of a pulp spy thriller, it's a pretty effective book. It's pretty fun. So I want to put it out there. I don't know how the whole series is. I'm judging on the series, and I haven't read the whole series. I think this is a classic. I think that the James Bond
nice.
I think the James Bond novels are classics. I really do want to make the caveat about the racial stuff, and I hope somebody who picks up a book from a British guy in 1958 is smart enough to realize it's going to be racist. I apologize for that on his behalf, and he was probably kind of a jerk about that sort of thing. But if you can get past that, I think this is a classic. It's a fun book to read, and it led to James Bond, and the James Bond character has adapted with the times in a way that I think kind of shows you mentally what you should be doing with reading early James Bond. Is that, adjusted for the times to try to figure out what you're dealing with. It's not cool. It's bad in some places, but I think overall, I think the James Bond books are classics.
All right. Well, there we go. It's fantastic.
So my name is Dave McArthur, and I'm going to wish everybody a fun farewell for this week.
My name is Clint Lanier, and I will do the same. We're going to sign off, but we will be back in 2 weeks with our movie choice, which is...
It's going to be something very similar. It is Dr. No. And we're breaking the rules, by the way, because as you could probably guess, I did not completely coincidentally choose Dr. No, the film, when Clint chose Dr. No, the book. So it's going to be two Clints in a row. Yeah,
so, I thought it'd be fun. I thought it'd be fun to actually do, because we've never done that. We've always done on the book, and then we've always done something unrelated. But this one, I thought, why not? Let's do Dr. No, the book, and then Dr. No, the movie, and we are going to compare and contrast a lot more in the next one, but we'll also talk about James Bond as a kind of cinema franchise,
which is very different. It's a very different thing. And in order to go along with that same theme, my next 2 choices are going to be Bridget Jones's Diary, the book, and then Bridget Jones's Diary, the film. We're going to be doing those back to back. So I hope everybody's going to stick around. And just in case you're actually considering not following our podcast, I'm not actually doing that. I want to let everybody know. So, all right,
that's wonderful.
Peace out.
All right, we'll see you next time.
That's it for episode 81 of Toasting the Classics. I want to apologize for the long delay in releasing this episode. Summer is insane, and I think we've earned a tiny break. I promise we are back on the regular schedule now. For those playing along at home, I think you can guess what we'll be drinking when we discuss the film version of Dr. No. If you'd like to get in touch, please send us an email at toastingtheclassics@gmail.com. Send us show ideas, comments, complaints, and any invitations to visit your secret lair on a private murder island. Check out my blog at theattractivenuisance.com and follow us on Twitter at @ractivenuisance. Our music was written by Michelle McArthur. See you next time on Toasting the Classics.